The marble steps of Arlington National Cemetery gleamed under the harsh November sun as Eleanor Patterson adjusted her worn black coat for the third time in 5 minutes. At 73, she had attended enough military ceremonies to know the protocol, but today felt different. Today, the entire nation was watching as the Unknown Soldier Monument was rededicated in honor of fallen heroes from recent conflicts. Eleanor clutched her small purse tighter, feeling the weight of the single photograph inside, the only picture she had left of her husband, Master Sergeant Thomas Patterson, who had died 37 years ago in a mission that officially never existed. She had received no flag ceremony, no military honors, no recognition. Just a quiet visit from men in dark suits who explained that her husband's death was classified and that she should never speak of his service. "Ma'am, you'll need to move to the family section," said a young Marine in dress blues, his voice polite but firm. He gestured toward a roped-off area filled with widows and families of recently fallen soldiers, all wearing fresh medals and holding flags that had been draped over coffins. Eleanor looked at her simple black dress, bought from a thrift store, then at the other military families in their formal attire with their official documentation and honored status. "I don't have the proper papers," she said quietly. The Marine's expression softened slightly. "What unit was your husband with, ma'am?" Eleanor hesitated. 37 years of keeping secrets didn't disappear easily. "I'm not supposed to talk about it." The Marine's confusion was evident. "Ma'am, if your husband served, you have every right to be here. Do you have his service records?" Eleanor's throat tightened. They said there were no records. Behind the Marine, she could see the VIP section filling with senators, generals, and families whose losses had been publicly mourned. Gold Star mothers wearing pins that proclaimed their sacrifice to the world. Widows whose husbands' names were etched in marble and bronze, remembered and honored. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the Marine said gently. "Perhaps you should speak with—" "It's fine," Eleanor interrupted, stepping back from the rope. "I'll watch from here." She found a spot on the grass slope behind the main ceremony, among tourists and casual observers. From here she could barely see the podium where President Harrison would soon speak about the nation's debt to its fallen heroes. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was close enough to see the man who would honor the dead, but too far away for him to see her. The ceremony began with military precision. Honor guards marched in perfect formation. A brass band played hymns that made Eleanor's chest ache with memories of Thomas's funeral, if you could call a quiet burial with 3 mourners a funeral. The president's voice carried across the cemetery as he spoke about sacrifice, honor, and the nation's commitment to never forget its heroes. Eleanor closed her eyes and remembered Thomas's last letter, the one that had arrived 2 weeks after the men in suits came to her door. He'd written about a mission he couldn't describe, about being part of something bigger than himself, about hoping she would understand if something happened to him. The greatest heroes, President Harrison's voice echoed across the cemetery, are often those whose stories we cannot tell, whose sacrifices remain hidden in the shadows of classified operations. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. Those words seemed aimed directly at her, as if the president somehow knew about the 37 years she had spent in silence. But the ceremony continued, and Eleanor remained invisible among the crowd. Gold Star. Families were called forward to receive commemorative medals. Widows were honored with special recognition. Names were read of soldiers whose valor had earned them posthumous decorations. Thomas's name was not among them. As the ceremony neared its end, Eleanor began to gather her small purse, preparing to leave as quietly as she had arrived. But then something unexpected happened. General McKinnon, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stepped to the microphone. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of decades in uniform, "I want to share a story that has been classified for 37 years. Eleanor froze, her purse half open. In 1987, a special operations mission was launched to rescue American hostages held in a compound that our government could not officially acknowledge. The mission required soldiers willing to operate without recognition, without official support, and without the promise that their sacrifice would ever be publicly honored. The cemetery had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. Master Sergeant Thomas Patterson volunteered for that mission, knowing that success would mean his actions would remain forever classified, and that failure would mean his death would go unrecognized. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank onto the grass, her purse spilling its contents. The photograph of Thomas in his dress uniform landed face up on the ground beside her. The mission succeeded, General McKinnon continued. 17 American hostages were brought home safely, but Master Sergeant Patterson paid the ultimate price, and his widow was told that his sacrifice could never be acknowledged. President Harrison had stepped closer to the microphone now, his face grave with the weight of long-held secrets. "Eleanor Patterson," the general's voice carried across the entire cemetery. "If you are listening, your nation owes you an apology that is 37 years overdue." Eleanor looked around wildly. People near her were staring, then looking back toward the podium, trying to understand what was happening. "Mrs. Patterson," President Harrison's voice now echoed through the speakers, "we know you're here today. We know you've attended this ceremony every year for the past decade, standing in the back, honoring not just your husband, but all the fallen heroes whose stories you understand better than most." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard, she thought, it might stop entirely. "How did they know? How had they found out? Would you please come forward?" the president asked gently. "It's time for this nation to properly honor both your husband's sacrifice and your 37 years of silent dignity." Every head in the cemetery turned, thousands of people searching the crowd for the widow they had overlooked. Eleanor remained, seated on the grass, clutching Thomas's photograph, unable to move or speak or breathe. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. The young Marine who had tried to help her earlier was kneeling beside her, his eyes bright with understanding. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think it's time to come home." Eleanor stared at the young Marine's outstretched hand, her mind reeling with 37 years of enforced silence crashing against this impossible moment. Around her, thousands of people had turned to search the crowd, their whispers creating a susurrus of anticipation that seemed to echo off the marble monuments. "I can't," she whispered, clutching Thomas's photograph against her chest. "They said I could never talk about it. They said it would endanger other operations." The Marine's expression was gentle but firm. "Ma'am, those orders came from a different time, different people. Today, the President of the United States is asking you to step forward. Those old restrictions no longer apply." From the podium, President Harrison's voice carried across the cemetery with patient authority. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand this is overwhelming. You've kept faith with your country's secrets for nearly 4 decades. But today, those secrets are being declassified. Today, your husband's heroism can finally be acknowledged." Eleanor looked toward the podium, so far away it seemed like another world. Between her and the president stretched hundreds of rows of folding chairs filled with military families, government officials, and dignitaries. The very people who had ignored her existence for 37 years. What if they were wrong? She asked the Marine. What if speaking about Thomas really did put people in danger? The young Marine smiled sadly. "Ma'am, my grandfather served in Vietnam. For 30 years he couldn't talk about missions that saved hundreds of lives because they were classified. When the records were finally released, we learned he was a hero, but he died before anyone could thank him properly." He gestured toward the podium. "Don't let that happen to your husband's memory." Eleanor struggled to her feet, her arthritis protesting after sitting on the cold ground. The photograph of Thomas fluttered in her trembling hands. A young soldier in dress blues, serious eyes, the slight smile that had captured her heart 50 years ago. "Mrs. Patterson," General McKinnon's voice echoed through the speakers, "we have something that belongs to you." On the massive screen behind the podium, images began to appear, classified documents with heavy black redactions, mission briefings stamped with security clearances Eleanor had never heard of. And then, impossibly, a photograph of Thomas that she had never seen before, him in combat gear, standing with a team of soldiers in what looked like a desert landscape. Eleanor gasped. In 37 years, she had never seen proof that Thomas's final mission had actually existed. The men in suits had taken everything, left her with only questions and silence. The hostage rescue operation of November 15, 1987, the general continued, was one of the most successful covert missions in American military history. 17 American civilians were extracted from a terrorist compound in conditions that would have meant certain death for conventional forces. The screen showed more images now, architectural plans, satellite photos, tactical diagrams that meant nothing to Eleanor, but everything to the military families watching in rapt attention. Master Sergeant Patterson volunteered to lead the extraction team into the most dangerous sector of the compound. His leadership and tactical brilliance enabled the mission's success, but enemy forces converged on his position during the final phase of the operation. Eleanor began walking toward the podium, each step feeling like a decade of suppressed grief finally finding expression. People in the crowd were standing now, making room for her passage, their faces filled with understanding and respect. The foe. Marine walked beside her, ready to catch her if she stumbled. "You're doing the right thing, Mom." As Eleanor moved through the crowd, she began to notice other faces in the audience, men and women in their 50s and 60s who were watching her with intense recognition. One woman near the VIP section was crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth. A man in a colonel's uniform stood at attention as she passed, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mrs. Patterson," President Harrison said as she drew closer, "I want you to meet some people who have been waiting 37 years to thank you." The screen behind the podium changed again, showing a group photograph of 17 civilians, men, women, and children, standing in what appeared to be an airport terminal. They looked exhausted but alive, grateful but haunted. "These are the American hostages your husband died to save," the president continued. "They were told they could never speak about their rescue, never mention the soldiers who brought them home, but 7 of them are here today." Eleanor's steps faltered as she recognized the woman who had been crying in the VIP section. Older now, gray-haired and lined with age, but unmistakably the young mother Eleanor had seen in Thomas's final letter, the one he had mentioned saving, the one with 2 small children. The woman stood and began walking toward Eleanor, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "my name is Margaret Chen. Your husband saved my life and the lives of my children." Eleanor stopped walking, overwhelmed by the reality of meeting someone Thomas had died to protect. He wrote about you in his last letter. He said you had 2 little ones." Margaret nodded. "David and Sarah, they're adults now with children of their own, grandchildren who exist because of what your husband did." Other figures were emerging from the crowd now, the rescued hostages, no longer bound by decades of enforced silence. A man in his 70s approached with a walker, his movements slow but determined. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Dr. Robert Williams. Your husband carried me out of that compound when I couldn't walk. I've thought about him every day for 37 years. Eleanor was surrounded now by the living testament to Thomas's sacrifice. People who had built lives, raised families, made contributions to the world because her husband had chosen to die for strangers rather than live for himself. "This is why we couldn't tell their stories before," President Harrison said, his voice carrying across the cemetery. "These people returned to lives that had to remain secret to protect ongoing operations and other potential hostages. But today, that chapter of American history can finally be written in full." Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her, grateful, aged, but alive. Thomas's death suddenly felt different, Not a meaningless loss in a forgotten conflict, but a sacrifice that had rippled through decades, creating families and futures that wouldn't have existed without his choice. "Ma'am," the young Marine said softly, "the President is waiting." Eleanor looked toward the podium where President Harrison stood with something in his hands, a folded flag and what appeared to be a small wooden box. As she resumed her walk toward the stage, the entire cemetery rose to its feet in spontaneous acknowledgement. Thousands of people, military families, government officials, tourists, veterans, standing in recognition of a woman who had carried her grief in silence for 37 years. But Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the wooden box in the President's hands, because she suddenly understood what it contained and why this moment had taken nearly 4 decades to arrive. Eleanor climbed the steps to the podium on unsteady legs, each marble step echoing with the weight of 37 years of silence. President Harrison waited at the top, his expression solemn and respectful, holding the folded flag and wooden box that represented a nation's long-overdue acknowledgement of Thomas's sacrifice. Behind the President, the Joint Chiefs of Staff stood, at attention, their uniforms gleaming with ribbons and decorations that paled in comparison to what Eleanor now understood was contained in that small wooden box. The rescued hostages had followed her to the stage, forming a semicircle of living witnesses to her husband's heroism. "Mrs. Patterson," President Harrison said, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery, "on behalf of a grateful nation, I want to apologize for the 37 years of silence imposed upon you and your husband's memory." Eleanor's hands shook as she accepted the folded flag, the one that should have been presented to her decades ago, the one that should have draped Thomas's coffin in a ceremony befitting his sacrifice. "This flag flew over the Capitol on the day Congress voted to declassify your husband's mission," the President continued. "It represents not just his service, but your service, the courage it took to honor a secret that must have felt like a burden as much as an honor." Eleanor pressed the flag against her chest, feeling the crisp folds that represented every fold she had made in her own life to accommodate a grief that couldn't be shared, a pride that couldn't be expressed, a loss that couldn't be properly mourned. But it was the wooden box that commanded her attention. She recognized it from photographs she had seen in museums and history books, the distinctive presentation case that contained America's highest military honor. "Mrs. Patterson," General McKinnon stepped forward, "your husband was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on November 15, 1987. The citation was signed, the honor approved, but the presentation was postponed indefinitely due to the classified nature of his mission." Eleanor's vision blurred with tears as the general opened the box to reveal the Medal of Honor in all its symbolic glory. The blue ribbon with 13 white stars, the bronze star medallion suspended from an eagle, the weight of a nation's highest recognition for valor, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, the general read from a document that had been sealed for decades. Master Sergeant Thomas Patterson distinguished himself through extraordinary heroism during the rescue of American hostages. When enemy forces threatened to overrun the extraction point, Sergeant Patterson voluntarily remained behind to provide covering fire, enabling the safe evacuation of 17 American civilians. The cemetery remained absolutely silent, thousands of people hanging on every word of a citation that was finally being read in public. Facing overwhelming enemy fire and certain death, Sergeant Patterson continued to engage hostile forces until his ammunition was exhausted. His final radio transmission was a request for confirmation that all hostages had reached safety. Upon receiving that confirmation, Sergeant Patterson's position was overrun. His selfless devotion to duty and ultimate sacrifice exemplify the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. Eleanor reached for the medal with trembling hands, but President Harrison gently stopped her. Mrs. Patterson, there's something else, something that has never been done before in the history of this award. The president knelt on one knee before Eleanor, holding the Medal of Honor in both hands. The image, the president of the United States kneeling before an elderly widow in a thrift store dress, was one that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. This medal belongs not just to your husband, but to you, President Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. You carried his secret, honored his memory in silence, and sacrificed your own recognition for the greater good of your country. The Medal of Honor recognizes extraordinary heroism, and Mrs. Patterson, what you have done for 37 years is nothing short of heroic. Eleanor looked down at the president kneeling before her, this powerful man who commanded armies and shaped the fate of nations, offering her the recognition that had been denied for nearly 4 decades. Around the ceremony, cameras flashed and recorded the moment when America finally acknowledged not just a fallen hero, but the woman who had carried his legacy in silence. I don't deserve this, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. I just kept quiet like they told me to. Margaret Chen, the hostage Thomas had saved, stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson, you deserve this more than anyone. You let us live our lives in freedom while you lived yours in silence. You protected the secret that protected us. Dr. Williams, leaning heavily on his walker, nodded emphatically. My grandchildren exist because of your husband's sacrifice and your silence. Without both, the mission would have been compromised. Other hostages would have died, and future operations would have been impossible. Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her. The rescued hostages, their families, military leaders, and thousands of observers who were witnessing something unprecedented in American military tradition. President Harrison, she said, finding her voice growing stronger, I have a question that I've carried for 37 years. The president remained kneeling, his attention focused entirely on her. Ask anything you want, Mrs. Patterson. Did Thomas know? When he volunteered for that mission, did he know that he might never be recognized? Did he know that I would have to keep his sacrifice secret? President Harrison's expression grew even more solemn. Mrs. Patterson, we have his service records, including his volunteer statement for the mission. Would you like me to read what he wrote? Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding. The president pulled out a document and read in a clear voice. I understand that this mission requires complete deniability and that recognition may never be possible. I volunteer because the mission is more important than the medals, and protecting innocent lives is more important than protecting my reputation. If something happens to me, please tell my wife Eleanor that her strength will carry on my service long after I'm gone. Eleanor's knees buckled, and the young Marine who had helped her earlier quickly stepped forward to support her. Thomas had known. He had chosen the mission knowing that she would bear the burden of his unrecognized sacrifice. He knew, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He knew what he was asking of me. President Harrison finally stood, placing the Medal of Honor gently around Eleanor's neck. The weight of it was surprisingly heavy, not just the physical weight of a bronze and ribbon, but the weight of recognition, acknowledgement, and a nation's gratitude finally expressed. Mrs. Patterson, the president said, your husband's heroism saved 17 lives. Your heroism preserved the secret that protected those lives and enabled future missions that saved countless others. Today, America honors both of you. As the medal settled against Eleanor's chest, the crowd erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of Arlington Cemetery. But Eleanor was no longer focused on the crowd, the cameras, or even the president. She was thinking about Thomas, about the choice he had made, and about the choice she had made every day for 37 years to honor his sacrifice in silence. Now, finally, that silence was broken. The applause continued for nearly 5 minutes, wave after wave of recognition washing over Eleanor as she stood on the podium wearing Thomas's Medal of Honor. But as the crowd finally began to quiet, President Harrison raised his hand for complete silence. "There is one more thing," he announced, his voice carrying an edge of anticipation that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with apprehension. General McKinnon stepped forward with another folder, this one thicker than the previous documents and bearing. Security classifications that Eleanor could see even from her position. "Mrs. Patterson, the mission your husband died completing was not an isolated operation. It was part of a larger program that continued for 15 years after his death." Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her feet. "I don't understand." "The intelligence gathered during your husband's final mission," the general continued, "led to the identification and successful rescue of over 200 American hostages held in various locations around the world. The tactics he developed, the sacrifice he made, became the foundation for America's most successful counterterrorism operations." The screen behind the podium came alive with images, newspaper clippings showing hostage releases that had made international headlines, families reuniting at airports, diplomatic victories that had shaped foreign policy for decades. "Every one of these operations," President Harrison said, "was built on the intelligence and tactical innovations that cost your husband his life. Thomas Patterson didn't just save 17 people, he saved hundreds." Eleanor stared at the screen, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she was being told. All those years of wondering if Thomas's death had meant anything, if his sacrifice had made a difference. And now she was learning that his final mission had rippled through decades of American foreign policy. "But there's more," the president continued, and Eleanor wondered how much more revelation her heart could withstand. "Mrs. Patterson, in the 15 years following your husband's death, there were 12 other classified operations based on his methods. 12 missions that succeeded because of what he taught us about hostage rescue." Margaret Chen stepped forward again, her voice steady despite her tears. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to meet my son, David." A man in his 40s approached the stage, and Eleanor immediately recognized Thomas in his eyes, the same serious expression, the same quiet strength. But it was his uniform that made Eleanor gasp. "Colonel David Chen, Special Operations Command," he introduced himself with a salute. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been studying your husband's tactics for my entire military career. The rescue methods he pioneered have been taught at the War College for 20 years. Eleanor looked around the stage, suddenly understanding that the gathering was more than a simple medal presentation. This was a reunion of people whose lives had been shaped by Thomas's sacrifice in ways she had never imagined. "The classified nature of your husband's mission," General McKinnon explained, "meant that his innovations couldn't be officially credited. But in the special operations community, Thomas Patterson has been a legend for decades. His methods have saved more lives than any single soldier in American history." Dr. Williams approached with his walker, his voice strong despite his age. "Mrs. Patterson, I became a trauma surgeon after my rescue. In 37 years of practicing medicine, I've saved approximately 4,000 lives. Every one of those people is alive because your husband saved me first." The magnitude of Thomas's legacy began to settle over Eleanor like a weight she had never imagined carrying. Not just 17 hostages, but hundreds. Not just one mission, but decades of successful operations. Not just one life saved, but thousands upon thousands of people who existed because Thomas had chosen to die for strangers. "Why now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now?" President Harrison exchanged glances with General McKinnon before answering. "Because, Mrs. Patterson, we need your help." Eleanor's confusion must have been evident on her face because the president quickly continued. "The program that grew from your husband's sacrifice has been declassified because we're facing new challenges that require the kind of innovation Thomas brought to impossible situations. We need to train a new generation of soldiers in the methods he pioneered." Margaret Chen's son stepped forward again. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been chosen to head the new Special Operations Training Initiative. We want to call it the Patterson Protocol, in honor of your husband's contributions." Eleanor felt dizzy. 37 years of silence. And now they wanted to name a military program after Thomas. I don't know what to say." "There's something else," the president added gently. "We'd like you to be involved in the program, not as a consultant or advisor, but as the keeper of your husband's legacy. The families of the soldiers we train deserve to understand the history behind the methods that might save their loved ones. Lives." Eleanor looked around the stage at the faces surrounding her, rescued hostages, their children who had grown up to serve their country, military leaders who had built careers on Thomas's innovations, and a president asking her to step out of 37 years of silence into a role she had never imagined. "Mrs. Patterson," said a voice from the audience, and Eleanor turned to see a young woman in military dress uniform approaching the stage. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, ma'am, Margaret Chen's daughter. I'm deploying with a special operations unit next month, using tactics your husband developed." Eleanor stared at the young woman who existed because Thomas had died to save her mother, who was now serving her country using methods Thomas had pioneered, creating a circle of sacrifice and service that spanned generations. "The question," President Harrison said softly, "is whether you're willing to let Thomas's story be told in full, whether you're ready to help us train soldiers who might face the same impossible choices your husband faced." Eleanor touched the Medal of Honor hanging around her neck, feeling its weight not just as recognition for Thomas's heroism, but as responsibility for his legacy. For 37 years, she had kept his secret. Now, they were asking her to share his story with the world. But as she looked around at the living consequences of Thomas's sacrifice, the saved hostages, their children and grandchildren, the soldiers trained in his methods, the thousands of lives touched by his final mission, Eleanor realized that keeping the secret had been the easy part. Now came the harder challenge, helping others understand what Thomas had understood that night in 1987, when he chose to stay behind so that others could go home. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger with each word. The president smiled. "We're asking you to help us teach heroes, Mrs. Patterson, just like Thomas taught us." 6 months after the ceremony at Arlington, Eleanor stood in front of a classroom at the Special Operations Training Center in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, looking at 24 young soldiers who represented the best and brightest of America's military. Their eyes held the same intensity she remembered seeing in Thomas's face all those years ago, the look of people willing to sacrifice everything for something greater than themselves. The walls around her were lined with photographs and documents that had been classified for decades, mission reports, tactical diagrams, and images of successful hostage rescues that had grown from Thomas's final operation. At the center of it all hung a large portrait of Thomas in his dress uniform, finally receiving the public recognition that had been denied for so long. "The Patterson Protocol," Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear, "is not about tactics or weapons or military strategy. It's about understanding that some missions require you to choose between personal recognition and mission success, and choosing the mission every time." The soldiers listened with rapt attention, understanding that they were receiving instruction from someone who had lived the consequences of such choices for nearly 4 decades. Colonel David Chen sat in the back of the classroom, now serving as Eleanor's co-instructor in the program that bore her husband's name. Beside him sat Lieutenant Sarah Chen, his sister, who had returned from her deployment with recommendations for improvements to the protocol based on real-world application. "Mrs. Patterson," raised her hand a young sergeant in the front row, "how do you prepare for a mission where success means your sacrifice will never be acknowledged?" Eleanor smiled, the same question Thomas had asked in his final letter. "Sergeant Williams, you don't prepare for that mission by thinking about recognition. You prepare by understanding that some things are more important than being remembered. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote a simple equation. Mission success, lives saved, legacy that matters. Your instructor, Colonel Chen, exists because my husband made that choice in 1987. His sister, Lieutenant Chen, serves her country using tactics my husband developed. Dr. Williams, who we heard from at Arlington, has saved 4,000 lives in his medical career. That's the mathematics of sacrifice. One choice creating infinite positive consequences. The classroom was absolutely silent. Young soldiers absorbing lessons that couldn't be found in any military manual. But here's what I want you to understand, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the authority that came from decades of hard-won wisdom. The choice to sacrifice recognition for mission success isn't just made once, in a moment of crisis. It's made every day, in every decision, to put the mission before your ego, the team before your advancement, the objective before your comfort. She pulled out a letter, not Thomas's final message to her, but one she had written to each class, of soldiers who went through the Patterson protocol training. I want to read you something, she said, unfolding the letter. This is what I wish someone had told me when I was 26 years old, standing in my kitchen, listening to men in suits explain that my husband had died for his country, but that his sacrifice could never be acknowledged. Eleanor cleared her throat and began to read. Service is not about the medals on your chest or the recognition in the newspapers. Service is about the lives you touch, the missions you complete, and the legacy you leave in the hearts of the people you protect. True heroism is often invisible, unrecognized, and unrewarded, but it is never without impact. She looked up at the young faces surrounding her. Some of you will receive medals and recognition for your service. Others will complete missions that remain classified forever. But all of you will have the opportunity to save lives, protect innocent people, and serve something greater than yourselves. A young lieutenant in the third row raised her hand. Mrs. Patterson, do you ever regret the 37 years of silence? Do you wish you could have told people about your husband's heroism sooner? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Lieutenant, I used to think that silence was my burden. But I've come to understand that silence was my service. Every year I kept Thomas's secret was another year that the methods he died developing could be used to save other people. My silence protected not just his legacy, but the lives of every person rescued using his tactics. She gestured toward the photographs lining the walls. 217 hostages rescued using the Patterson protocol. 43 special operations soldiers trained in his methods who went on to become instructors themselves. Thousands of lives saved because the tactical innovations Thomas died for remained operational secrets until they could be properly declassified. Margaret Chen entered the classroom quietly, now serving as the civilian liaison for the Patterson Protocol program. At 74, she remained an eloquent spokesman for the families who had been rescued through special operations missions. Mrs. Patterson, she said, addressing Eleanor with the respect that had grown between them over the months of working together. We have news from the Joint Chiefs. Eleanor turned, recognizing the tone that meant something significant had developed. The Patterson Protocol has been so successful, Margaret continued, that NATO has requested permission to implement it in their special operations training. 12 allied nations want to send soldiers here to learn from you. Eleanor looked around the classroom at the young soldiers who had become not just students, but the next generation of heroes who would carry Thomas's legacy forward. The scope of impact was expanding beyond anything she had imagined possible. There's something else, Margaret added with a smile. The Pentagon has approved funding for the Eleanor Patterson Institute for Special Operations Innovation. They want to establish a permanent training center where the families of fallen special operations soldiers can help teach the next generation. Eleanor felt the weight of recognition, not just for Thomas, but for her own decades of service. The invisible burden she had carried for 37 years was becoming the foundation for programs that would save lives for generations to come. "Mrs. Patterson," said Colonel Chen, standing at the back of the classroom, "there's one more thing. We've received word that the mission scheduled for next month, the one using Patterson protocol methods, will be led by soldiers trained in this very classroom." Eleanor looked at the young faces surrounding her, understanding that some of them would soon face the same impossible choices Thomas had faced in 1987. Some of them might make the same sacrifice he had made. Some of them might return home to families who would never fully understand what they had done. But now, unlike in Thomas's time, their families would have support. They would have the Eleanor Patterson Institute. They would have the knowledge that their silence, if required, would be honored service rather than forgotten sacrifice. "Class dismissed," Eleanor said softly, watching as 24 young soldiers filed out to continue their training, carrying with them the lessons learned from a man whose heroism had finally been acknowledged and a woman whose silence had finally been transformed into voice. As the classroom emptied, Eleanor remained standing before Thomas's portrait, the Medal of Honor still around her neck, understanding finally that her real mission was just beginning. Thomas had saved 17 people. In one night, Eleanor would spend the rest of her life helping to save thousands. The silence was over. The service continued.